Hello everybody, Adam Steele here, and this is part 5 of our Reaper tutorial series. Today we're talking about stems. Quite often you'll hear producers, mix engineers asking for stems, so we're going to talk about what are they, how do you get them, how do you send different types of different tracks in different formats, different styles to people using Reaper without too much hassle. That's today's video, let's go. So there's a lot to go at with this topic, but I'm going to try and break it down so that I don't throw it all at you at once, because it's the kind of thing where if I just try and go blah, 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 it will be quite disorienting. So let's start with the difference between a master mix and stems. As far as a digital audio workstation is concerned, a master mix is not mastering. They're two completely different things. What the master mix is, and I'm going to pull up the mix window here in Reaper. The master mix is this thing on the left, this channel here that says master. And what that means is when we hit play, what we hear out of the speakers, that's the master. That's the master mix, which means that it's all the other channels put together and then processed through any effects that are in the insert effects there on the master, and then put out. And that is what we call the master. Mastering is a process to do with getting something ready for radio release. That's something that's technique-based rather than software-based. You can do mastering, technically speaking, in any program. So that's something that I might talk about in a completely different series. In fact, I did a video about mastering using Ozone very recently. It might even be in this playlist. So if that's what you're interested in, that is not this. Check it out. The difference between a master mix and stems is that if you look at the master mix and then look at all the tracks next to them, each one of these tracks could be considered a stem. You think about it as kind of pieces of a tree. The master mix is all of it. The stems are each separate branch. And the way that we talked about routing before with folders and sends and that kind of thing, you can decide when you're exporting stems, if somebody wants you to send them the audio of, say, the separate drums, the separate bass, the separate guitars, you can decide whether to send them each separate drum channel, for instance, or just the drums as a stereo file. That is also considered a stem. It depends what an engineer is asking for as well. So if someone says, can you send me the stems, always talk to them more, clarify, because the meanings of these terms can get quite muddied, and just ask, do you mean you want every individual microphone, or do you just want, say, one of drums, one of bass, one of rhythm guitars, for instance, one of lead guitars? Quite often I find that people like, I don't know, dance producers doing a remix, they quite often want one of just all drums, one of all guitars. They don't want to be dealing with 20 different microphones on a drum kit. But if you're sending it out to a mix engineer, for example, and you're assuming that they don't use Reaper, or they're not using this software, then you do want to send them each track for each individual microphone, and that way they get a file for each one, and they can deal with that however they deem fit. Most of today's video is going to talk about rendering, or bouncing, some people call it, exporting your finished work as files that other people can use, basically. Let's start with the simple. Let's say that this little bit here that we've got highlighted, this track, if I just hit play on that, let's say that that's our finished track, I'm just going to bring out the time selection a little bit, because if you look at the time selection, it actually stops before the track is over. And that's, generally speaking, a bad thing. Generally speaking, if you're sending someone a song, you want your start of your time selection to start just a little split second before your track actually gets going, just so that when they hit play, their device has that little split second to kind of gather its what have you and get going without just kind of going and making awful noises. And I tend to want to make sure that the time selection goes on to just a little bit, tiny bit, after the song's finished, so that anything like reverbs, delays, that kind of thing, have time to play out. However much you decide is entirely up to you. But yeah, I like to do that. Unless I'm sending someone a section of a song just to listen to a clip or whatever, that's also possible. So what we want to do, and we'll be looking at this box a lot, is go to File and Render. Now this brings up a box with a lot going on. You would think render would be dead easy. You just go, I want a file, please, click. But the thing about Reaper is there are so many options, which is really powerful. That does mean that you need to kind of learn how this layout affects you, because different people want different things. So let's start at the top and work our way down and explain what I mean as I go. So the first thing we tick is Source is a drop-down menu, and then we've got Master Mix, which I was talking about is the stereo output. Stems, selected tracks, which I'll come back to in a minute. Master Mix and Stems, give us both. Selected tracks via Master, that's something a little bit different. I think that's new. That's pretty cool. And then the selected media items, also via Master, which means if there's any master processing, that ends up on there. And Region Render Matrix, which we'll talk about at the end of the video. That's advanced level stuff, but we will cover it. So for now, we just want that to be Master Mix. And then the bounds, that is to say where this whole thing starts and where it ends, by default is entire project, which for me is usually way too much. So there's a custom time range thing. Again, I don't tend to use that, but time selection is what I do. So you saw where I lit this whole section up. That means that now the time selection has predefined the section that we're going to get. And then below that was project regions and selected regions, which, again, we're going to talk about in a minute. There's a tail button, so if you want an extra second or whatever of gap on there at the end, you can tick that box. I tend to do that myself using the time selection, and then that's that. So output directory is the folder where we want our files to go, and you can browse for a directory, or in this drop down where it says browse, there's usually the folder your project has already been saved in, already been working in. It's a nice little shortcut that'll save you some time. You can just click it, that'll pre-fill that box. Now, file name, that can be anything you like. And for a master, just a master mix, I do tend to find that I just type this out manually. But in this box, you can put certain things in here so that it will make a name for you, which is very powerful when you're trying to export 20, 30, 100 different channels all at once. You can make this, name them properly, without you having to do it for every single one. Massive time saver. So for now, this project's called Tutorial Audio. I'm just going to call this DK for dark, or DT for Dark Tranquility, section 1. And so where it says render 2 below it, that's telling us what the file folder and everything name is going to be. And it just says one file next to it, because with us doing a master mix, we're only going to get one file. Very useful. So the next thing down is the sample rate, which really depends on who's asked you for what. Generally speaking, the sample rate should be the same as the project sample rate you were running at, in which case here it was 44,100, which is the same as the top right. We can see 44.1. Channels stereo. Again, you might want to be sending someone a mono mix or something like that. I don't know. Then there's full speed offline, which is what I tend to use, which is when you hit go, the computer does its job fast as it can. Then if you've had any issues with that, you can do one speed offline where you don't hear it, but it goes in real time, so that if you've got any effects that need to run in real time for some reason, that can work. Online render means that it actually plays that whole section back and records the output that way, which again, if you're using something like the UAD cards, that kind of thing, which need to process quite often in real time, that can make things much easier, and you can listen as you go. And then there are idle versions, which is where the processor is told, you know, if you don't have the processing power, don't worry about it, stuff like that. Resample mode if needed. If you're working exporting to a different sample rate to the one you were working at, I tend to like cranking this up myself. So high quality or extreme high quality, because then if you are working at a different file format, at least you get the benefit of it trying really hard to make it sound as good as it can in a different sample rate. So I'll go past these buttons here and come back to them when we talk about stems again. Now let's talk about the output format. So if I drop this down, we've got quite a few options here. And the top one, the one that's selected by default, is Wave. Wave is a lossless format, which means that whatever you get out of Reaper is exactly what will go into this file. The files end up quite big, but it means that the level of quality and detail is literally pristine. Below that, we've got AIFF, which is Apple's version of a WAV file. It's to all intents and purposes identical. Audio CD image, you might want to use that at the very end of a mastering stage when you're actually making a CD and you want that to be a single file. That's something that's relatively complicated. Same with DDP, that's to do with mastering, and that's to do with that whole specific format. FLAC, free lossless audio codec, that makes the files a bit smaller, but you can only play them back on certain devices that can play FLACs. MP3, good old MP3. A lot of people want smaller files that can be sent by email, or just internet-friendly files, so MP3 tends to be the one. OGG, Vorbis, and Opus are like a free version. Reaper does video now, so there are a few different options there, and then there's WavePack, which is like FLAC, so it's kind of smaller WAV files, but it takes more processing power to play them back. Let's stick with Wave for now. And then you get bit depth, which generally speaking, I tend to stick with 24-bit PCM because that's pretty much full quality. You can go higher than that if we're talking about some real esoteric stuff. And you can go down to 16-bit, say if you're finished with your file and it's going on a CD. CDs are 16-bit, so you need your files to be 16-bit to match that. The rest of this I'm not particularly worried about. Write broadcast chunk. You can include any markers or regions which we're about to talk about in the file, so that if you're putting this into something like Logic or another version of Reaper or Pro Tools or whatever, those markers come up so you can add in things like here's an intro, here's a chorus, here's the middle eight, and they come up in that file and they can be seen and read, and that tends to make engineers' life a little more easy. There are a few more buttons down here which we're not going to worry about right now, and then there's render one file. So if I hit that render one file, that's going to do that, and that's very quickly thrown that out to a file for us. If you've got more effects and more processing going on in a project, this will start to get slower and slower as you've loaded the project up. That's to be expected because you're making the computer do more work. That means that when you tell it to go full speed, it's going to take a bit longer than it would have otherwise done with a relatively easy project. Now that was a master mix. So what we're going to do now is export some stems. Let's say a friend of ours is an engineer and we've got a song, he really likes it, he wants to do his own version of it, but he wants you to give him the separate parts. So what we do is we open our mix window and we select the tracks we want to send him. So I use Control and click. I think it's a different set of buttons on a Mac. But if I Control and click the ones I want, I can unclick the ones I don't want. So let's say these 5 that I've selected, Track of Stuff, Le MIDI, drums, the reverb, they're the ones we want to send to them as stems. So they're now highlighted and selected. We're going to go back to File and Render and just move this so we can see what's going on. So let's call this Dark Tranquility Stems by changing the name. And now we're going to change the source from Master Mix to Stems, Selected Tracks. Now, where it said 1 file down here before, it now says 5 files. Now, if I click that, that tells me what each file is going to be called. And right now they're stems 001, 002, 003. That's nice. The naming scheme is now difficult, but we can change that. This is where we start to talk about wildcards, because where it says the file name and wildcards right here, if I click wildcards, that gives me a big list of things that I can throw in there, which have a $, then a name. And when you hit render, it will change that code that you put in there into something useful. So a good example is, let's call this dark dash, and then add in a wildcard for track number. Now that says track number there, but if we go down to our 5 files, that's now named them dark 01, 02, 03, 04, 05. If we'd selected different stems, the track number below them would be the one that would be used. If I hit dash and add another one of $track, that has actually put the name of the track in there. So if I click 5 files again, you can see now that they're called dark 01, track of stuff, dark 02, La MIDI, and so on and so on. So whatever we've named those tracks will then be added in there. So then if I add another dash or a space or whatever you want to add in there, let's add some more wildcards. So how about, what have we got? Position length, output format, where we can use the sample rate, and in there we can add the bit depth, because that now tells us those files are the 44.1K 24-bit files. If I also add in the output format, so that now says the 44K 24-bit wave, that's now in the file name, so that an engineer looking at that doesn't even have to open the file to know exactly what they've been given. Now that's really useful, because if I change this to, say, 16-bit and then 48K, the names of all of those should now change. Yeah, so they've become 48,016, and so on and so forth. That means that we go to the next bit. If I was to get these 44.1 and all the names are done, we've got all these selected, and there's an extra button which now coming down here, I can tick tracks with only mono media to mono files. That can be quite useful if you're sending someone, say, you've got a ton of guitar tracks to send somebody. You don't want to be sending stereo files to someone when it's only, say, one guitar channel that was recorded in mono. Reaper likes to do everything in stereo because that's more useful usually for us, but when sending a file, if you've not got any kind of stereo chorus or processing or anything on that, and you want to keep your file size down and keep it simple for the engineers, you just click that button. And if there's anything like a stereo keyboard part or stereo drum overheads, they still get sent as stereo files, but then if it's just mono, it gets sent as a single one, which can be a real headache saver for the engineer you're sending it to. They will probably thank you for this. When you're ready with all these, you hit render 5 files, and that shows us all those levels as we go, and that's now done. And all those stems, and that could have been 20 stems, that could have been 30, that could have been 100, all done. It was that quick. We took some time to decide what we were going to name those songs, name those parts even, but now if I was to do that again and go back to my render window, I'm using a keyboard shortcut to bring that back up. if I decided, okay, well, someone else wants the stems, but they want an MP3 version, it's a bit odd, but okay. Let's say they want 48K MP3. So let's just say that this is all right. This is just for an example, crazy as it seems. And let's say render 5 files. Now, the first time you install Reaper and try and export an MP3, it does quite often tell you that you can't render an MP3 because you need a certain plugin that isn't supplied with Reaper for copyright purposes and all that kind of thing, but it does give you a link to where you can find it. You follow the simple steps to drop that in the Reaper program folder, and suddenly MP3 access is yours without having to pay a lot extra for it. Another way that you save money using Reaper for that 20-second extra step. Something to be aware of though if you're offline, because you only need to do that the once. Next up, let's talk about regions. Let's hide this for a minute. So, let's say you've got more than one song or more than one piece in a Reaper project. I find it's quite common with things like, say I've been working on an audio book and you've got all these different chapters, for example, or you've got an album where you've got all the different songs. It can be really quite tedious to have to select a time selection, export that with the right name, select the next one, export that with the right name, especially if you get all your settings, you feel it's right, you send it off to the client and you get some feedback going, that's great, can you change a little bit of this and a little bit of that? And it's the kind of thing that affects the whole project. Like, I don't know, for instance, on an audiobook, maybe they want a little bit more treble on the vocal, maybe they want a bit more de-essing on the vocal, for example. That then means that every chapter you would then, if they want every chapter separately, you would then have to export them all again, and that's a massive time sink, and that's a massive pain. Not with regions. Regions, I remember when these came in as new, and these saved me days of time. I'm not even kidding. A lot of the stuff that I do that's not just bands is stuff like voiceover work, and it can be a massive time saver. If you've got 100 little sections and they want a file for each one of them, and you want to make one little change, I can now do that, hit render, and in 5 minutes of export and 20 seconds of my time, they've got 100 files again. That's the kind of thing that can save you a lot of work. So let's talk about this. So regions. This grey section at the top, that's a region. I'm just going to get rid of that for a minute. So if we make a time selection anywhere, and let's say we do that bit, you can right click on the timeline and we can create a region from a selection. The shortcut is Shift and R. I use that quite a lot. Now, this little drums bit down here, let's say that's our next section. So if I want to select that as well, I can set that to be a region with Shift and R. So we've now got two completely separate regions of the track. Now, the regions, if I shift and double click where it says number 1, I can call that, say, main song, and I can call number 2 a drum bit. Not only does that make it simpler for me when I zoom out because I can see which section is which, but it also means that when we come back to the whole rendering thing, like I was talking about before, that can save us loads of time and help with our file naming so that later on we don't have to do any of it twice. So let's say we could have 12 of these in an album, we could have 100. If I now go to File and Render, make sure our source is back on the master mix. So we only want the master mix for each of these sections, one for the main song, one for the drum bit. Now I can choose these to be 44.1 kilohertz wave as they were before, but let's take this whole big name away. So instead we can use the wildcards again So instead of the source master mix, that's right, we want to change the time selection to project regions. And now it says there are 2 regions. So there are 2 regions selected, and that means that it's going to export them both separately as separate files. If we quickly go into the region manager here, that gives us a list of all the regions. If I make this window a little bigger, we can have it, if we tick these boxes, or we can change the colors of the regions, that's new. But we can have these selected. So where it says render matrix, you can just select it to say master mix. We're not going to go hugely into detail on the region matrix yet. We'll get back to that in just a minute. But if we select the master mix here for each one of these, then that means that each one of those is going to give us its master mix. If we hadn't gone into that region manager, it was going to do that by default for every region. Let's say we've got 12 tracks and we only want to export the regions of 6 of them. We go into the render matrix and just choose the ones we want. Now in the name, let's do the whole wildcard thing again. So if I go to wildcards and go region number, put another dash and then the name of the region, if I look at render 2 and look at the 2 files, that's now going to say 01 main song and 02 drum bit. Just to be clever, if I put dash mix 1 at the end, that now means that I've got a properly named file with dash mix 1 at the end, and I could have that for every single region. I can put whatever I like in custom on the name as well as those wildcards, and so I can keep a track of everything, have lots and lots of files properly named. It's not going to have human error in the mistakes as long as it was spelled properly the first time, and that means that it's all organized and done for me. If I was to hit render on that, that'll plow through the first one, but then you'll see it change and it did the second one straight afterwards. And it will do one, then the next, then the next, then the next, then the next, until it's done. And that can save you tons of time. Now, the last thing to talk about is the region render matrix. The region render matrix, if we go to view region render matrix, which doesn't have a keyboard shortcut by default, we see a big load of squares. And if you've got loads of tracks and loads of regions, this comes up as a big, huge grid. So if I add another few regions, you'll see them all start to come up in this matrix. So if I add another region, another region, another region, I'm not naming them, but you can see 3, 4, and 5 have appeared here. Now, this is where it can get very clever, because quite often, if I've been working on a project for a band, they wanted to record live, so we've just recorded, say, an entire EP in one project. But one song's got extra guitar solos, one song's got a choir on it, one song's got saxophone on it, I don't know. But if I then told it to render me out all the stems for all the regions, I'd end up with loads of files that were just useless, that were just blank. Because let's say we had 12 tracks and I said, render all the stems for all these channels. If, say, there was a guitar solo on one song and not on the other 11, I'd have 11 blank guitar solo files. That's a lot of wasted space. So what I could do is use the region render matrix, and then so we tick the boxes for the tracks we want it to spit out. So let's say on number 1, there's track of stuff and the La MIDI. I want the reverb on both of them, and I only want the drums on region 2, because those are the tracks that I know I want sound out of. And that's it. From there, I go to render. There's a nice little shortcut here. And I go region render matrix. And that's now set up. If I go to where it says 8 files, I can now add in where it says region number region. So let's say add track number and then track. So now if we look at that, so we get track 00 is the master because that comes before everything. And then it gives us proper numbers for every track, and we don't get files we're not going to need. And this still means that if we close down the region render matrix as it's saved and close down the render window, if for some reason we need to make a correction later on, we can do this again with a single button press, and it will keep all those changes that we've made on those tracks without us having to do so much work. Recalls suddenly become very, very easy indeed. And again, this is something that saved me days upon days of work. If I get a phone call from a band saying, we really love the mix, but can you change this? Can you change that? Also, we want the stems and we need them now. I can then go, okay, here's your change, sounds good to me. All the stems, region render matrix, click. Come back in 10 minutes when it's all rendered, send it all off, I'm done. And in the meantime, I could just go and have a coffee and wait for it to do its thing and know confidently that everything's taken care of. The one last thing that I am going to talk about, and there is one more thing, is the render queue, because that's another great time saver. So if I open, at the bottom here it says add to render queue and open render queue. So the open render queue does exactly what it says, but render queuing means that if I've got lots of different renders to do, maybe they're of different projects or they're for different file formats, I can queue them all up. Then when they're ready, hit render all and let the machine do its thing without me. So let's say they want all these render matrix things as they are, so I can add that to the render queue. And that, when I open my render queue, means that there's now one item in there, which is all the regions from that file. And I can do this with several project files as well, so I can go into different ones, queue up different renders, and when I'm ready, I hit render all and it opens up each project. You can tell it to wait to load things like drum samples for however many seconds, and then it will go and it will do them all one by one by one by one. That saves you so much time. Hope that was useful. Okay, everyone, hope you really enjoyed this particular slugfest of technical stuff about saving different types of files. Next, in part 6, we're going to get funky with remote control. That is to say, using iPads, iPhones, Android, laptops, tablets to remotely control Reapers, starting and stopping in different volumes and different headphone mixes, all sorts of cool stuff like that, because that can make things more useful if you've got a big monolithic studio setup and you just want to get away from the desk. So we'll be checking that out very shortly. Thank you everybody for watching. Check us out on Patreon if you haven't already, because supporting us on Patreon really helps us to keep the lights on and keep this whole thing going. Thank you everybody for watching, and we'll see you in the next part and in the next video that we do. Thank you everyone, we'll see you soon, bye. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this, feel free to check out our other videos as you can find here, or check out our Facebook and Twitter, or our Patreon page, which helps us to make more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.